go. All right, so we're going to open in prayer. I will do that to open. We're also going to close in prayer. So I'm a youth group leader, and I will ask somebody at the end to please lead us in prayer. And I'm happy to wait until somebody volunteers. So think about if you feel that nudge when we're done. It could be a short prayer that said, "Thank God we're done." You know, there be that. So let's pray. Gracious and Heavenly Father, we give thanks for our time together today. We give thanks for those who are with us and all those who do this important work in our congregations and in our synod. Bless our time together. Help us to just take what we can from this. Help us to know that so many of us are doing the best we can, and workshops like this are just a way for us to do better without adding more stress. In your name we pray. Amen. So we're going to get started. I'm going to share my screen, which means I am not going to be able to see very many of you, just a few of you on the side. If for some reason you're not seeing what I'm sharing, please speak out, because I may not be able to see you if you're waving your hands or doing stuff. So we're going to start. Again, all of these resources, including these slides, will be shared with you after we conclude our time, and we'll get to it. There we go. All right. So a lot of our time today, all of this is based on something called the ELCA Congregational Audit Guide. It's a document, if you've ever used the ELCA resources tab to find things. This one's pretty easy to find. Some of their resources on their website aren't very intuitive. These are, but if you've never seen the resources on elca.org, I encourage you to check those out. But if you go to the resources tab that's at the in their homepage, there's a click on that, and there's a financial option. The financial option has some sub tabs, but your most helpful tab is probably the congregations tab, which has all kinds of information besides this audit guide. But that's something that I invite you to look at when you have a chance. And also on that page is a financial and accounting guide for those who are working with finances in your congregation. There's a model audit committee charter, and we'll talk about the audit committee a little later. But it's got some guidelines. If someone says, well, what exactly are you asking me to do? That's a good document to share. And there are some sample policies and best practices resources on there. I think they're helpful as well. So this is where this all stems from, where this information that I'm sharing today stems from. This document itself, the Congregation Audit Guide, is a long document, and it can be pretty intimidating if you just direct somebody to that guide. It's broken down into, the first part is a lot of question and answers about the need for an audit. And the last part of it is what they call a congregational audit program. It's a step-by-step instructions, and that's great. The disadvantage to it is that it's a lot of instructions, and sometimes, especially for a smaller congregation, it can be kind of confusing, and there's a lot of unnecessary things in there that you might not need to do. So just know that when you look at it. But it is a great document with lots of resources, and that's where the information today starts from. Often I have been asked over the years to work with congregations and do audits because they don't have someone who can do that for them. And it's often very expensive to hire a CPA to do that. I will say it's not my favorite thing to do, and I only have limited months in the year where I have the available time to do that. But when I started doing this, I took the ELCA audit guide and I created a financial review audit template, and it takes the items from the ELCA audit guide, and to me, it simplifies them. It's more geared towards smaller congregations. They're easier. I've coached a couple congregations when they've set up their audit committees and gone through how to do this with members of their audit committee. And that document I've used to help with that. So I will share that with you after this meeting. Do know it's not an ELCA sanctioned guide. There's nothing in there that isn't in the ELCA guide, but it's not something that they've ever seen. Our bishop has seen it, but I don't think anybody in the ELCA has. And you'll notice today, I'll interchange the word audit and financial review. I'll explain that a little bit later, but if you ask any CPA, there are specific definitions for an audit versus a financial review. And often when you have an in-house audit committee doing the work, what you are doing is more of a financial review than an audit. I like to call it a financial review because that's truer to what it is. The ELCA calls it audit everywhere. So you just know that if you compared what you did with an auditor with a CPA, they'd probably say it's more of a financial review as well. So what is an audit? And this is an ELCA definition. And so you can, and I will not today read everything that's on the slides because I figure you guys can do that. But this one I will because it's their definition. It's an independent evaluation of the financial records and internal controls of the congregation for the purpose of providing an opinion on the reasonableness of the congregation's financial statements and recommending improvements to internal controls. What is important here is that an audit committee is doing the best that they can to provide their opinion of whether the financial reporting and the congregation's financial statements are accurate to the best of their knowledge, to the best of what they're able to do. And so it is not an end all to like, yep, every transaction was right, everything is, A1 okay, but within what you're able to review, it's reasonable to assume that the records are materially, and that's an accounting word, correct. I will say this at this point, I know that we have a variety of people on this call. And so as we're going through this, if you look at information that's on here and you think those words don't make sense to me because I'm not an accountant or I don't do finances, please don't panic. We're going to talk about the overall reasoning, and hopefully you can take this back to someone in your congregation or someone who may understand this a little bit better. I've tried not to use as many accounting-y words, but they're there because it is finances. So, but don't feel like I have no idea. We're going to talk about kind of the whys and the what's and the basis for what we do. So what is the difference between an audit and a financial review? And these are a couple of good comparisons that I found. An audit is a thorough examination. It provides an opinion. It provides a reasonable level of assurance. A review is an assessment of your financial statements. Basically, what you're wanting to do is to look and see, hey, what can we do better? What things are we missing? What things aren't we doing? And then it's an evaluation of the financial data, and it provides a moderate level of assurance. These two definitions are accounting with CPAs and what's general accounting principles. These are the two differences. what I would say is, again, an audit committee is probably providing more of what an auditor would call a review than an actual audit, where you're tying all the figures in and trying to figure that. An audit committee does some of that, but a lot of it is about processes. So this is kind of the basis of why we're here today. Why would a congregation want to do this? Often we think, well, it seems like if we're doing this, we're not trusting the people who are keeping our finances. This is absolutely not that. It is the mark of a responsibility for a congregation to do this, and hopefully on an annual basis. It's good stewardship. It is telling the people and your members and those who donate that you care about their contributions. We, in the best interest of stewardship, want to make sure that we're doing and caring for those correctly. And it's also to, we'll talk about this in the next slide. Well, we'll just go to the next slide. It's to protect people. You want to protect, many congregations have volunteers doing this work. And even if you don't have a volunteer, you want to protect the people that are doing that work from being able to be accused or questioned about what they do, have unwarranted charges or things come up that are looked at negatively. It protects your congregation, your reputation, your trust, and the trust and confidence of your supporters. It assures, especially if you have change, often we do these when a new pastor is called, or there's change in your treasurer. It's just to make sure that the people coming into these new roles can be assured that they're not inheriting something that has some issues. We want to make sure, often churches, congregations are given gifts that have some designation with them and some stipulation of how they're going to be used. And part of doing this is to make sure we're caring for those gifts in the way that, and they're accounted for in the right way. And it provides check and balance. Again, as we go through this, you'll see we're not going to, an audit committee does not go through every single transaction for the whole year. You're going to take a sampling to be able to provide, a good assurance of, based on what you looked at, that yes, things are following good checks and balances and good oversight. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And we'll go back and see if anybody has any questions in this first part. This is probably the part with the least questions because there's not much to question in it. Okay, I'm gonna.
I have a question.
Yeah, John.
So when you said you don't have to go over, everything over the course of a year, you just have to do a sample. How do you define a sample?
We'll go through that in this,
Okay.
in the other parts. The ELCA guide has some suggestions for like percentages, but there's different things that you look at that you may sample, 1% or 5%. There's other ones that to go through that actually have you kind of look at various types of expenses or gifts or things that stand out. If you're a really small congregation, you could go through a lot of your transactions, but you really just want to take a good sampling of that, and those will be identified. And the ELCA guide really identifies like how many to look at. So good
Thanks.
question. And there are some things you will look at, like every one of them, like every month's financial statements, but not every transaction that takes place in that. So. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. This is the part I'm nervous about. See if I can get back to where I was without a whole lot of clicking. So hold on. All right. Just have to get to the point where I can, yeah, there we go. So if you look at the ELCA model constitution, it provides for the establishment of an audit committee. There is a section, chapter 13 of the ELCA model constitution for congregations, that lists congregation committees. And it defines this, the definition that is part of that model constitution of an audit committee is listed there. This is not a required provision. So if you ask to look at your congregation's constitution, it might still be in there. It might not. Your congregation might have taken that out. But it really is a pretty structured method of creating this committee. It asks, 3 voting members who are actually elected. They serve a 3-year term with 1 member being elected each year. So you have some continuity. So it's pretty structured here. I've been a part of 3 ELCA congregations, and I can tell you none of them had audit committees. We had audits, but each year it was a different group of people. So if you're following this or trying to work to follow this, good for you. This is really a great way of doing it, because you're not rotating everybody off. You've got people with some knowledge from the prior year, and so that's a great way to do it. But also know that very often that's not how it happens. Very often you're searching for people to do that. There may be no election. If you don't have an actual election, I would strongly recommend that your church council notes that they appoint this committee, and that's noted in the minutes because they are tasked with this responsibility. So.
Hey, Terry, can I ask a question regarding this, or do you want us to hold our questions till you?
No, you can go ahead. I'm just worried about missing people. That's why I said, but go ahead.
Okay, I was just wondering, reading this, so the term is 3 years. You have an election, 3 committee members get elected. So it's impossible to have an election every year if the first 3 people are elected the same year. So yeah. Is it one person you say, only does 1 year and that way you're electing somebody new? Is that how the idea of this is structured?
I think from starting from scratch, you would need to do that to have them be rotated, to have them be staggering years. If you're electing all 3, if you're just starting out with this, you're going to elect all 3. One's going to be elected for a term of 1 year, 1 for 2, 1 for 3. They can be elected, they can run for re-election. But if you keep those terms staggering, even if the people run for re-election, it's going to naturally stagger after that. So let's say you're a person that runs for 1 year, they're off that very first year, but they run again. Well, now they've got 3 more years. So they're not going to end at the same time with the other persons on there, if that makes sense. Does that answer that? All right, I'm going to assume so. So here is what an audit committee is meant to do. It's meant to provide oversight and reasonable assurance of good stewardship. Again, this isn't saying everything that we found is exactly on board. It isn't saying we can say for sure there is no misinformation or no misclassification. It's saying from what we've looked at, we can provide reasonable assurance of that. And so congregations have options of how to do this annual audit or financial review. The first is obviously you can hire a professional, have a professional audit done by an independent accounting firm or auditor. You can do an internal audit or financial review performed by independent members of the congregation with some accounting or financial background. I would say this sometimes in our congregations, we can encourage people to step into a role and they kind of learn as they go, or they can walk with someone doing it and learn it. Finances, it's hard to do that. People have to have at least some comfortability with numbers, some knowledge that otherwise it's going to make it very tough. So they may not need to work in accounting, but they at least have some type of knowledge in that, comfortability with it, or some financial background. In my time as working as a controller in a property management firm, we managed over 250 different homeowners associations, and each had their own board and each had their own treasurer. And I was the connecting point with the treasurers. And I do remember a treasurer coming in one day for me to explain financial statements to him. And I said the words, well, when you reconcile your bank account, and the blank look on his face made me realize he's never reconciled his bank account. And so, that was the type of person who was trying to do a job, but he just had no background at all in it. So, and when we say independent, in your congregation, that means independent of anybody who's doing any of the financial work. So if somebody is a counter of the offerings, they should not be somebody who's doing the financial review. They need to be completely independent of any of your financial processes. And that is the challenge for our smaller congregations. Often they are utilizing the only people in the congregation who have some financial knowledge or willingness. And so they can't review their own books because they've tapped out on the people who are capable of doing that. Often we, and the ELCA recommends rotating these two. So maybe you do 2 years of an internal review and another year of an outside review, just to kind of get that assurance that there's something deeper, or, whatever type of rotation you might want to do. It is encouraged that you do that every so often. And so who can perform a congregational audit or financial review? We've got, we've talked about the accounting principles and practices. They have to have the time to devote to this, and that they're willing to follow through on asking banks and donors for information. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Another thing that's can be a challenge in this is your records are kept at the church, and it's easiest if they can come to the church and sit there and do that work. Sometimes that can't happen, but so if it needs to happen when there's some office staff there, that might mean their availability needs to be during the week, or it may mean that you are able to allow them access on the weekend when they can have access to the records. So just be realistic about what the timing needs to be for their drain on their time. It's not something that's quick. It all depends. How long it takes depends on how large your congregation is and what shape the records are in. If they're very disorganized or not complete, it's going to take them a lot longer because they're going to have to really work to be able to tie some numbers in to be able to find what they're looking for. Something that we suggested years ago for small congregations is that perhaps you've got 2 people in your congregation who are doing your finances, and if you have a neighboring congregation in a fairly short geographic area, that your people that do your records can review the books of the other church and vice versa. That gives people with some knowledge. It does take a lot of coordination, and I know it doesn't make it easy, but it is an option for smaller congregations. Also reach out to your neighboring congregations. Maybe they have accounting professionals, or you have accounting professionals in your congregation who aren't already involved in the finances. And, you know, maybe if they're a member of your church or another church, they might be willing to do this at a lower rate. Do know if you're engaging a professional, you can ask them, what is the difference in the cost between a review and a full audit? And then, of course, there's you can go with an outside firm or accounting organization. I did ask the question when I set up the registration for this, if anybody had used outside firm, and there were only like 3 people, 3 congregations that had. One didn't give the name, one said they wouldn't recommend them, and the other said yes, they would. But I don't have the name, but sometimes people will contact the Synod office and ask for names of places that do this. And right now, I just don't have those resources, but I'm going to try to work to see if I can find out from congregations if there are those they recommend. So these are the things that an audit should do. And you see these here, you're looking at reporting, how your receipts are handled, and that doesn't just include your offering, that includes other income that comes into your church, maybe fundraisers or facility use, different things like that. How are those handled? Are they kept safe until they're counted? To verify what the congregation owes. What do we owe on our property? What do we owe on our leases or anything that we are in debt for? To ensure that things are recorded properly, that expenses are followed, and we'll go through this, that there is oversight in that and approval. There's a process for this so that things can't be paid without someone seeing it. And that we're documenting the use of our donated funds correctly. It's really important in a congregation that we're honoring our donors' wishes. And general offering is not designated, but congregations receive all other kinds of donations, you know, whether it be for disaster relief or a special fund or thing that we're raising funds for. We need to make sure that the funds that are received and that they're noted correctly and that they're used for that purpose, not something else. And in addition to financial transaction, an auditor is going to look at these other things too. The accounting controls and segregation of duties. These 2 things are the biggest things I would say that your review should focus on. Yes, to confirm transactions and to sample those and make sure they're accurate, but to look at how things are done in your congregation so that we can have internal controls, and that not one person is responsible or has oversight of something from start to finish with no other eyes on it. There's so many times we hear of things happening, and it's because, oh, congregation had someone that was willing to do it, and it's finances. And man, if you find someone who's willing to do it and they're doing it, and we're not going to say anything, right? You know, we don't want to get in the midst of it. It's all going good. We're getting financial reports, you know, but we have to protect not just our resources, but we have to protect the people that are doing the work as well. Went to look and make sure we have adequate insurance coverage, that we maintain our records of meeting minutes, especially those with financial implications, that our records are showing what the donors' stipulations for the use of their funds are. And then what funds are subject to review? Of course, anything that is funds that come in for the church. If you have a preschool and they are utilizing your congregation's tax ID number, they are part of your oversight as well and should be reviewed. Your council should be receiving reports, consistent reports on that. If you have a welfare or women of the ELCA group that has a separate account, but again, using your church's tax ID number, those records should be produced. If you have an endowment committee or endowment fund, often congregations that I've reviewed have if they have an endowment committee, they don't really get any reports from the endowment committee, and that they should. The church council is responsible for that. Even if there's a separate committee that's doing the work, they should be reporting, and that is part of the review as well. And then if you have any other bank accounts maintained by any group, many years ago, a lot of youth groups had separate bank accounts. Again, what determines this is if they're using your same tax ID number on their account. So we're going to break for next questions.
I have a question. Well, go
Yeah,
ahead.
Peter.
So I have a quick question just for everybody out here. Do they all have their own tax IDs? My congregation went through this before, and way back, we didn't end up with our own one. We had to get one from the ELCA.
It's usually part of the process when a congregation is established. So
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We have
Yeah.
one. St. Andrews has an independent tax ID number.
Yeah, here San Lutheran has its own tax ID, but apparently we're sharing it with the preschool, so I appreciate that comment.
Yeah.
I guess I have two questions, if I may, and one may or may not be directly related. How many churches with preschools have them separate from the church? Or is it more common to have them, under the same tax ID?
The ones I know of that I've been told, it's typically they use the same tax ID.
Okay,
Often it's considered a ministry of the church, so they use that. I can't speak, I don't know for sure over our whole synod, but the ones I've run across in either helping them with their questions or looking at their books, they share the same tax ID.
second question, does anybody have any experience with what you would pay an outside individual organization to do a financial review? We're trying to find someone, and I've got no idea what we should anticipate paying.
Terry, I can probably share a couple. I work with a couple of different nonprofits. One's a very small nonprofit, and the only reason they need to have an audit done by a CPA firm is because they get government grants and they're required, and it's about $7,500, and the auditor comes in for a couple of days, and it's pretty simple. Another organization, much more complicated, runs about $18,000 a year for the audit, and it's much more involved. So kind of give you two frames of reference there.
I appreciate it.
Peter, there is one, and I can reach out. She'll be on the call on Tuesday night. There is one congregation where she said they used an outside firm. I just need to make sure that they used it for an audit, because it seems like it's a payroll company. So, but if they're in the San Diego area, so once I confirm that on Tuesday, if they indeed did that, I can share that information with you.
Open if you're going in.
Okay, thank you.
Brian, what did you ask?
I'm sorry, I was wondering, I'm under the assumption that my church does share their tax ID with the preschool. So do you have a separate sheet of specifics of what you want audited for the preschool?
No, the template, the financial review template that I'll share with you that I created has preschool stuff listed on there, and then just with the note saying if applicable. So so you're kind of looking at some of the same things. Look at the financial reporting. When we go through this, you can kind of see that there's some differences in language. When you're looking at income for a church, you're looking at mostly contributions and some other outside income. With preschools, you're looking at tuition payments, you know, but same general practice. What I find when I've reviewed some churches whose preschools share a tax ID number, they really think, well, they have a preschool board and they meet, and the preschool board gets the financial reports. And that's great, but the church council should also be getting those reports on a consistent basis, because ultimately the oversight falls with the church council. The preschool board is a board, but the oversight, because it's utilizing the church's tax ID number, falls with the church. So you want to make sure you're at least getting consistent reporting and that they're included in what you review. Just one more thing relating to the tax ID number. Your congregation is considered a 501c3 organization through the eyes of the IRS. That helps you a lot for different, might be for some grants, it might be for some discounts, different places, and often you're asked, well, we need the copy of your exemption letter from the IRS. All ELCA congregations and synods fall under the ELCA's group exemption with the IRS. So if you need that letter, the ELCA needs to produce that. And what they do is they produce a letter naming your congregation, listing your congregation's tax ID number, and confirming that you are on the roster of the ELCA and you fall under the group exemption. You can't just on your own, even with a copy of the ELCA's group exemption, send them that and say, well, we fall under that. You need the letter and the copy of the group exemption. And there's a simple process for requesting that. Once you get it, you can always keep that. The ELCA will send it to you. You can always keep it on file. And so if someone asks you for it, especially if you're doing like fundraisers or things outside in the community, they'll say, we need proof that you're a 501c3 nonprofit. So if you need that information, let me know. I can forward you what the ELCA needs from you. You just email, and they're pretty quick at responding to that. Okay, any other questions? Okay, we're going to jump back in. Oops. All right, let me see what I did. There we go. All right, so the next part, we're going to talk about more of the logistics of what do we need to look at and what process do we follow. These are some of the things that you need to, so if you're working with the person, your treasurer, or your bookkeeper, or whoever does that work in your congregation, to prepare for this review, these are some of the things that you'll need to look at. There are complete listings in both the ELCA audit guide and the template I prepared. And those are helpful to give them well in advance so that they can get these records ready for you and organized. I won't say it enough. If it's just everything thrown into a box, it's going to take your committee members a lot longer to do this work. If it's organized and easily, records are easily found and labeled, that's going to save you a lot of time. So the more heads up you can give to the person or persons who have this information so that they can prepare and organize it for you, the better. So you're going to look at policies. If there are any written policies and procedures, don't panic. Most congregations don't have written policies and procedures, but there's a lot to be said about developing those. Even if you do them one little bit at a time, it helps in transition of employees. It helps in transition of volunteers. It makes it clear what things need to be followed. The ELCA website does have some sample policies. Sometimes your insurance company may have sample policies. And your procedures, you don't need to follow any type of guide. You can just go through what your procedures are and write those down, and look at those to see, you know, what is being done. How can we do this better? How can we have more clarity and oversight in this? You're going to look at minutes. If you have a finance committee, in addition to church council, if you have a finance committee or other boards, you're going to want to see their minutes. What you're looking for in there are any decisions that involve financial matters. And you want to make sure, they want to make sure that larger things are noted in the minutes. If there's something that the minutes identify that needs to be done, you want to make sure that those are done, all financial related. And so you'll want to look at those. Monthly financial statements for the audit year. Hopefully your council is being provided with monthly financial statements. And you want to review those. Bank and investment account statements and their reconciliations, any journal entries or adjustments, all of your paid invoices, payroll, online banking, your financial, if you have a financial secretary, often your financial secretary, and it's not noted this way in all congregations, but your financial secretary is often the person that works with donations and oversees your counters and that part of it. So financial secretary is more the income side, donation related. And then typically your treasurer is someone who is involved in the more of the expense side. You want to look at the insurance policies, or at least the declaration page. I don't know many people who can read an insurance policy. But your declarations pages will note what your coverage amounts are, and you want to make sure that those are in line. If your congregation, you don't have those in your records, you can request those from your agent. Annual reporting, there's a couple different types of annual reporting. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but you want to make sure your congregation is doing that. So I always start any review process with an introductory meeting, and this can be done in person, or as the past few years have led us, it can be done on Zoom. But between your audit committee members and the congregation treasurer and financial secretary, I also invite others who may be involved in the financial processes. So if maybe your office administrator is heavily involved in the financial processes that take place on a daily basis, I would encourage that person to be at the meeting. If your preschool is operating under your same tax ID number, I would encourage the preschool director or someone who works with their finances to be part of that meeting. Just kind of go through, I didn't clean them up for this meeting, but I do kind of have the questions that I ask when I go into congregations to do this work. And for me, I'm coming in there as someone who doesn't know anybody in the church. So I probably ask a lot more questions, but it helps you understand how things flow, how transactions flow, who handles things, what processes are in place, who approves things. It even may help you if you don't know, like often you'll see either in minutes or in maybe bill approval, some names, and you might not even know who is that person. Why is this person approving it? So this initial meeting is a good starting point just to get some background information and some understanding. If there's any written financial policies or procedures, this would be a great meeting to look at them. And if there's not, if there's any ones that they can give you or any type of written, this is the, the procedure we follow, that is helpful as well. There is this whole process again is listed step by step in great detail in the ELCA audit guide and in detail on the template that I created. So enough that it you can follow it step by step. After you get started, the next step is to create bank and donor confirmation. These are letters that are sent where the bank and your donors are asked to confirm the figure. Like, for example, the bank, this is you state, this is what we reflect our balance as of this date. Does this confirm with your records? Donors, same thing. Our records show you contributed X amount in this given year that is being reviewed. Does this confirm with your records? In the ELCA audit guide, there are examples of these two type of letters, a bank confirmation letter and a donor confirmation letter. With donors, the ELCA recommends you sample a minimum of 1% of the donors. Typically when I do it, I do more towards 5%, and I try to select a variety of donors, from smaller donors to larger donors. Pick ones that may contribute to a number of different designated funds or very few, just kind of a sampling of that. You can also send a confirmation letter to the Synod office to confirm what the Synod's records show that you have sent through the Synod in mission support and any designated gifts. There is no example letter for that. You just send a letter to the Synod and I get it, and it just, all you need to tell me is we're reviewing this time period, what do you show our gifts are, and I'll reply to that. I do recommend, I've over the last couple of years had more challenges with banks in trying to get these letters back. So I would encourage talking to your branch to find out where that might be sent, because sometimes they have corporate offices that do that. I have run across some that do charge for that. So you have to take that into consideration, whether you want to pay a fee to have that balance confirmed. There might be a simpler process if they don't have to answer a letter. They might be able to send you just an email with that information. You do have bank statements, so hopefully that confirms. This is just to make sure that those bank statements are accurate. The next thing you're going to look at is banking and investments. You're going to look at all of your bank accounts. You want to check and make sure that the signers that are authorized on each account that's who's actually signing the checks. You should have reflected in your council minutes anytime there's a change in bank signers. Your council should approve that, and often banks will ask for copies of those minutes in order to make that change. Even if they don't, it should be noted in the minutes when there's changes in your signers. Most of the time, if you don't get copies with your bank statement, nobody gets actual canceled checks back, but often, like with our bank, we get copies of the canceled checks with our statement, or you have a way to go online and pull those. And again, you're going to look at maybe a sampling of those to see how they're signed. You want financial statements, and you want to look at your financial statements for the month end and confirm that that is consistent with what the reconciled balance is. Often I run into, when I look at congregations where they've reconciled their account, they've printed their financial statements, and then they will go and add some more entries for that month after they've done the financial statements and reconciled their account. And so then you'll find that those may not line up if more entries have been made after those reports and that reconciliation is done. One suggestion is to ask for a copy of the general ledger, because then you can look and see what actually occurred after that, and most of the time you can tie in why there's a discrepancy. If you by chance have petty cash, you want to be able to count that and confirm that it matches at year end with the balance that's in it. If you're reviewing the records much later than year end, usually you're not reviewing them right at year end, you're going to need to just confirm what's in there matches the current balance. It's more rare for people to have petty cash these days.
Terry, can I ask another question?
Sure.
What is the sense in bank statements and reconciliations? If we get a bank statement, it's going to have all the pertinent information. If we're looking at the reconciliation, like you just said, we'll need to account for donations, or sorry, deposits that happened within the timeline that doesn't line up on the reconciliation form. So can we just use the bank statements to compile the information?
You can, but the reason for looking at the financial statements is you want to be able to say that your council and whoever's reviewing these financial statements on a monthly basis are being provided with accurate information. So, and over my years here, we have had some councils that have been given financial statements that aren't accurate, they're intentionally not accurate. So, so they were given a set of financial statements that did not match up with the general ledger. So again, part of this is to make sure that this information that your council is going by and your congregation at their annual meeting is going by is the correct information that matches what is in that general ledger. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I apologize. I thought you were asking for a bank reconciliation statement, not necessarily the congressional.
Yep. All right. So you're also going to look at income and receipts. You're going to use typically in most congregations, and you should be doing this when your counters count the offering, there should be some type of reconciliation sheet with it, something that provides the background of what was being deposited, whose donations were included in that deposit. So you want to look at a random sample of that to make sure to look at that sheet, whatever they're filling out, to make sure that that matches with your general ledger. Typically, I would pick one per month. And I rotate when in the month that is, in case you have teams of people counting. So and often certain weeks of the month are higher than others. So I would pick just one of these a month to reconcile or to compare to the general ledger and to compare to the donor statements, make sure that these match. You also want to, and you might get some of this information when you do that initial meeting, you want to confirm that money received is deposited in a timely manner. So you hopefully with the information that is being kept about your donations, there's also some type of receipt of when that was received at the bank. If money, you also want to find out if money is received during the week, like in the mail before the counters count, where is that kept? Is it kept in a safe location? So you just want to look at the overall, the accuracy of what's being done, make sure there's enough detail provided and that it matches with what's being put into the general ledger. Often in congregations, there'll be a team that's counting it. Your financial secretary might review that, but then it's going to be up to the person who's keeping your books, whether it be your treasurer, your accountant, or sometimes it's an office administrator who's actually entering that information into whatever program you're using to produce your financial statements. So you want to make sure that that's being entered accurately. So then this is a quick summary. Again, the ELCA audit guide goes more step by step in parts of all of these, but I've just kind of summarized the key parts. Then reviewing disbursements, you want to look at the council minutes for any actions or votes requiring disbursements of funds to make sure that that agrees with what was decided at the council meeting. You want to look at a sample of bill payments, of transactions. I don't remember if the ELCA guide has a percentage for this. I think it does. I usually do 10 types of varying expenses per quarter. So I'm looking at 40 throughout the year. Sounds like a lot, but some of them go fast as long as the documentation is there. But I want to make sure I'm looking for, is there a substantiation, an invoice or a bill or a check request? Is it, you know, are there steps made so things aren't double paid? Is there approval? Who is approving this for payment? Is it just up to the person writing the check, or is there an actual process and notation of who approves things? And then proper classification into the type of expense it is. So, and I will say, when I've worked with smaller congregations, this is the most challenging area, is this approval process. And the key in the area of expenses is you don't want any one person to be in charge of, or be able to do something from start to finish. And start means, you know, receiving the bill, paying the bill, signing the check, or approving the bill and signing the check, and then finally reconciling the account. I can't tell you how it's just, your internal controls are just so, there is no internal control if you've got one person doing almost all of those. That means anybody can pay or write a check, and there's really no oversight into it at all. In a small congregation especially, you have to be creative as to how you do that. Maybe you have somebody opening the mail who writes the check, but then somebody else should be approving it and somebody else should be signing it. And if you can't provide at least 3 people in that process in some way, shape, or form, and that process includes reconciling the account, because think of it, if somebody's able to write and sign checks and they're reconciling the account, nobody's going to see anything. Nobody's going to see anything that looks unusual. So just in the days of these days of working remotely, you have to be creative of how you do that, which means you may need to get that approval by email. You may need to have someone come in once a week and sign checks. You may have to come up with a process for making any online payments, so that it's just, because think of it this way, an online payment doesn't require a signature. One person has access, and one person can pay anything online without anybody else seeing it. You know, so you want to make sure that who's ever doing those online payments can get approval. And if it means sending a list of, these are the bills I'm going to pay online this week, and getting the approval by email, that's what you need to do, so that you protect the person doing that work. And it's very important that if the same person who is writing your checks is doing your reconciliations, that you have the ability that somebody else reviews those reconciliations. So somebody else is looking at those bank statements. That allows it, because again, we know it's hard to have a whole lot of people involved in this process when you don't have a whole lot of people able to do this work. And when you're approving, things are being approved, try to find somebody who understands the expense, not just someone who has no idea and they're putting their signature on it, but whether it be the team member or the committee member or the person on council, or the pastor or staff member who's requesting it, that is looking at the bill saying, yes, this is the amount we agreed to, this is consistent, we got the work done. Because often the person writing the check has no idea. So I would say this is the area that I spend the most time on when I'm reviewing things, because there is a process that is important to follow, and you want to make sure that there's not money going out of your congregation that you don't know about and doesn't follow this process. You're going to look at payroll. Select a sample of at least one pay period per quarter. You want to look at whether you have your payroll done in-house or by an outside company. There should be payroll registers for each payroll. And go through and match those amounts in your general ledger. Make sure that payroll is done properly. You want to look at who your employees are. That's a question typically I ask at the initial meeting. Who are your employees and who are your independent contractors? You want to make sure your employees are classified right as exempt, meaning what we typically call salaried or non-hourly employees, or non-exempt. And non-exempt means they're hourly and they need to fill out a time card and they need to be paid for overtime. Especially preschools, if often are in churches, I find the ones who have the most time cards, because usually all of them are on time cards. Make sure those are completed and approved by a supervisor before they're, and kept with the payroll. It's important that you classify your employees correctly. And it's hard because for years, churches labeled a lot of their employees as independent contractors when they really weren't, or they paid them a salary when they're an hourly employee and overtime applies to them. And the state over the years has cracked down on this, and they know that churches tend to have these areas that they may not do 100% by the law. So we want to make sure that we follow what we can in that. Want to look at payroll tax returns. You want to look at your W-2s at year end. Your pastors, although they don't have payroll taxes deducted, they should be receiving a W-2 and not a 1099. Many years ago, when I first started here, it was common that clergy received 1099s, but the IRS's recommendation is that they receive a W-2. They are employees, and even though they don't have a lot of their compensation is housing allowance, and it gets reported in a different area of the W-2, they still should be getting a W-2. And then clergy housing allowances, when you're looking at the congregation minutes, you want to make sure at the start of each year that it is recorded in your council minutes what your clergy are designating for their housing allowance for that year. That's important for them. If they need to substantiate that for the IRS at any point, they're going to ask for those minutes. So just make sure that at the start of the year that they say for 2022, I am designating this X amount of my compensation towards my clergy housing allowance. There's nothing that the congregation needs to do but report it in the minutes. You can't say that's too high, that's too low. You just record it so that they have that. And you want to see if you're collecting W-4s. W-2s are that year-end report that reports what people earn in salary and compensation. W-4s are what your employees fill out at the beginning of the year to say what their withholding allowances are. It's a good practice to just do that every year, have them update it just in case something has changed. Independent contractors, I often ask for a list of all the disbursements for the year by vendor, and I look at those vendors to see who might be eligible to receive a 1099. And eligibility means that they've been paid $600 or more in a calendar year, and they're not a corporation. And if you look at that list and then you ask for copies of the 1099s, if there are some vendors who are not getting those, you want to note that in your report. I encourage church administrators or those working, anytime you have a new vendor a new independent contractor start work in your congregation, before you pay them the very first time, you get that W-9 from them. Even if you know they're a corporation, you just get it from them, let them fill it out, that identifies them, then you don't have to worry about it if they reach that $600 threshold during the year. If you wait till the end of the year and then say, oh, look, they did earn over $600, and let's say you're not paying them anymore and you contact them and say, hey, I need this W-9 filled out, They're not real motivated to do that when they're not working for you anymore. They're very motivated if they're not going to get it until they get their first to get their first check. So, and then you don't have to worry about it. You just know when you set them up in your system as a vendor, as a independent contractor, you've got their W-9. We're going to look at the government filings. There is a state nonprofit corporation statement of information. It's called an SI-1 in California. It's filed every other year in California. It just lists the officers of your corporation and your address. And there's like a $20 filing fee. You can do it all online. And you can go online if you're not sure whether you filed that. You can go online and look that up just using your corporation number or your corporation name. In Hawaii, it's called an annual report, and it's filed every year. So those are the two reports to keep your nonprofit corporation status. If you have a change in your officers in between your filings, you're supposed to go in and file an updated report. I know in California, they don't charge you when you do that report in between times just to update your officers. The other annual reporting is something from your county your property tax exemption reporting. Comes from your county recorder or county property tax person. I can't think of the name, sorry. And this is a crucial report to keep your religious exemption for property taxes. It used to be that they would just send a postcard every year and you checked off whether it is, if stuff had changed. Now it's a more detailed report. It varies by county, but they do ask you for all the people who are using your property, who also have use of your property. Churches are given a religious exemption, and in order to keep your religious exemption and not pay the high property taxes on your property, it means you are not renting your property to other people who don't have that same religious exemption. So be careful of who you're renting your property to. You can't just say, oh, they're a nonprofit. They need to have a religious exemption. It's a tricky area, and it's gotten trickier because of the new ways that the county property tax organization has been asking for these reports.
How does that work with preschools, especially when they share the same tax ID?
Does your preschool have do they have a chapel service?
I do not know.
Typically one of the, and I'm not the expert on property taxes, so I'll just say that. But one of the things, part of the religious exemption is that there is some type of worship happening. And so to keep that, there has to be some type of worship. If they're falling under your tax ID number, there's worship happening with your church. The preschool is part of it, but often preschools have chapels too. So that should not be a problem at all. It's more when you're renting out to for many years, lots of congregations hosted like traffic schools there and things like that. It's the reason you hear of when you have 12-step groups meeting at your property. They're not a religious exemption. If they pay, it's usually considered a donation, not rent. So that's how you kind of get around that. There's a lot of legal stuff with this, especially relating to cell towers, that I am not probably the person to talk to, but if you have questions about that, let us know.
Thank you.
You're going to look at the declarations page for each of your insurance policies. These are some of the ones you may have. Definitely commercial liability, umbrella, directors and officers. All but accident and medical, I think, is an optional one. I know the Synod has one, but I don't know if congregations always do. You want to look at that you've got them in place, and you want to reconcile what they say the premium is to what is being paid. And again, if your office person can't find the declarations pages for that, encourage them to contact your insurance before you do the review and get that. You want to review financial reports. and make sure they reflect an accurate picture. Make sure that your council is getting not just a statement of income and expenses, but they're also getting a balance sheet or a statement of financial position to show that your cash and liability and equity balances. Make sure that your reporting is consistent, and that there's an annual budget that's approved by the congregation, and your reports should include a comparison to that budget so that your council can see how are we doing based on what we thought we would. And then when you're looking, I encourage you to look at the prior year end balance sheet with the period that you're reviewing. And if there are any substantial changes on that balance sheet, that you identify what those are, get some clarity on those, and then note those in your report so that that's a part of your report. So we're going to break for a question before we go into the very last part. This is probably the hardest part, and I went through it fast, of all the different things to look at. Again, both the documents I'll send you afterwards have a lot more detail, but those are the general areas when you're looking at what am I reviewing? What are we doing? All right. Are we ready to move on? I promise we're almost done.
Terry, can I ask you one question?
Absolutely.
The audit guide, where can I find that?
I'm going to send you the link or the PDF of it afterwards, but it's found, the ELCA audit guide is found on the ELCA website under resources. And then if you go under resources, there's a financial section and it has all kinds of stuff in it, including that audit guide. But I'll send you, after this is over, I'll send you a link with the PDF of it.
Thank you.
All right, this last part. So the overall encompassing theme of this whole review is to evaluate internal controls. And this is, I can't stress it enough. If you evaluate nothing more, to evaluate how the processes are done so that you've got people involved who, and a separation of duties, so you have lots of eyes on things. It is the best thing you can do for your congregation. Again, you know, we want to make sure that what is being reported to our councils and to our congregation is reliable, and that the assets that you have are safeguarded and we're good stewards of what we've been entrusted with. So the areas of concern that you should look, and these are just things you can look at in this whole process. You'll run across these, but the financial secretary and the church treasurer should not be related. One handles, and whatever you term that person that's in charge of overseeing donations and the recording and the counting of them. That person should not be related to the church treasurer. Again, an income and a disbursement side of all of this. The person performing the audit review should not be related to either of these people. At least two unrelated people should count Sunday collections, neither being the financial secretary or treasurer. I know it's very common in congregations because it's easy to have a husband and wife team count together because it only means one family is staying after. That should not happen. You should not, two people counting should not be related. And when possible, you should have those teams of people, even if it's just two teams of people, rotate so that it's not the same people counting every week. And it seems like I might not have to say this, but money should never be taken home or off site to count. I know that there's congregations where it's counted on a different day, maybe put in a safe at the church. which, best case scenario, it's counted right after the service, and it's taken to a bank where it can be dropped, in a night drop or something like that. We know that's not always possible. I did have our insurance agent tell us once, if you put the money in a safe and you don't count it till Tuesday and it's stolen on Monday, you have no idea how much money was stolen, so you can't report it on your insurance. So that was from an insurance agent, the practicality of counting it right away. Any of your processes for income or receipts and disbursements, different people should be involved in those processes. Make sure that there's something in place for disbursement review and approval. And we talked about this, about check signing. 2 check signers are always recommended. We know that's not the norm. If you can't do that, the signer should not, and it's only one signer, it should not be the authorizer of the expenses or the person performing the bank reconciliations. Make sure that there's some type of process established for online transactions, that they're just not handled by one person, that there's another set of eyes on what's going through that. And bank reconciliations, preferred that someone who neither approves or signs the checks or makes the deposit is part of that. Again, another set of eyes on all of that. When you're all done, where an auditor's report to the finance committee and our church council will be prepared. And these are the things that the written report should include. In the ELCA audit guide on page 25 is a sample report form. And it includes these type of things. It details documentation of what steps you took, what items you did review. If there were any items that you weren't given to review, list those there so that it is known that we were not able to look at these things. We weren't given this. An audit conclusion, and there's a sample of what that looks like in the audit guide. The conclusion just identifies the material accuracy of the records. It doesn't say every transaction was right. We didn't find any, numerical errors or computation errors. It's just saying materially, we found these reports to be reliable. And then you can list some comments and recommendations. What I would suggest is that you keep those kind of broad. But what I would also suggest is that before you put this report together, you should sit down with your treasurer, financial secretary, or anybody involved in the process that you feel should be there, and go through any questions you might have, any information you might be missing. Let them know, hey, these are the areas that I've found, and allow them to resolve any questions or issues. Sometimes it could be you just didn't have all the necessary information. It also could be you weren't understanding it correctly. You want to give them a chance to clear up any things that might be questionable before you write this report that goes to the church council. And then once the report is prepared and everybody agrees on the findings, they may not be happy with some of the findings, but agrees that it's an accurate presentation. The recommendations that are given, make sure that if you're going to give recommendations that you explain those, what those might look like, and the tone of the report. So often the tone of the report, even if you find things that can be done better, you really have to acknowledge the work that is being done, often by volunteers. And so make sure that there's some grace in that, and many times our volunteers aren't trained in this area. So just keep that in mind as you're writing your report. This report goes to the finance committee if you have one, and the congregation council. It is not required that it goes to the whole congregation, but if somebody asks for it, they have the right to see it, but it's not something you usually broadly publicize out there. You can note that it was reviewed and our council accepted it, would be in your minutes, But the full report is not usually something that's put out there, but people do have the option of requesting it. Many years ago, there used to be a form that you sent into the Synod that the ELCA had on their website. That's been gone for a long time. Occasionally, I'll get one or two of them sent a year, and I put it in your congregation file. It's not required that you send it to us, though. So this is on here just so that when you get these slides, you'll have my email address. But we'll wrap it up for any other questions. I didn't give you a whole lot of time, but I'm here as long as you need me.
Thank you for putting this together, Terry.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I know it's a lot of information and it's so much in your face. I do have one question for all of you. Would it have been helpful, because I debated yesterday whether to do this, to send out those documents before this? So you have them in front of you, or I was afraid it would be like way overwhelming to have the documents that I'm talking about in front of you. So
I would have preferred it ahead of time.
okay.
Yeah, same here. If you get it ahead of time, then some of the notes we're taking, we might not need to take because it's already written down.
Okay,
Yeah, Terry,
Yeah,
and send
I
out the
agree.
PowerPoint.
ahead of time.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'd probably
and-
send out the notes page, I guess, for people to take notes.
yeah. Could you also back up to the additional questions where it shows your contact information? It came through on, at least on my computer, as incorrect. It said N4 dash whatever. So I just want to verify the phone number.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna put it in the chat because that's easier. I just put
Okay.
it on that final slide, figuring that you'd have that afterwards and you pull it. Not that you'd write it down, but here, and I'm putting my phone number. So
Thank you.
thank you. My only worry about sending out all the slides ahead of time is then people won't show up. So, I mean, they still have it, but I just thought then they're gonna say, well, okay, but maybe the notes page and then the slide, but I will send you an email with all of this stuff with the PDFs. And if you think of questions afterwards, you know how to reach me. I'm here. So
Terry, I thought it was such a nice broad overview and a great introduction to what you're going to be sending out. And I can guarantee I wouldn't have looked through this stuff. And after having gone through this, I'll know more what it is that I'm looking at. And it kind of helped organize my thoughts. So I appreciate it.
all right, thank you. Thank you.
Terry?
Yeah.
Is one of the documents you're sending out in like a checklist form? Because looking at the presentation, it's like, I see the need to create a checklist of, these are all the things that I need to make sure that I go through for the church. These are all the things I need to make sure I go through for the preschool. These are all the ones I need to make sure for contractors. So do you already have a checklist put together, or? I mean, I don't mind creating my own. I just figured if you already had one.
Yeah, no, the ELCA audit guide, their audit program, the really detailed thing is kind of in checklist form with lots of information. The template, and I'll just keep calling it a template because that's how I've listed it, because I use it as a template that I created, also has a checklist. It is like, here's all the records you need to get. Here's the first step. You meet with, these people, and the first step of the process is to do the bank confirmations, and then there's subcategories in there. So look at that and see if that answers it. But I think it helps you step by step follow it a bit better.
Perfect. I appreciate it. I've done a lot of personal financial reviews, but this will be my first for an organization, which is fine. I just wanted to make sure I didn't leave anything on the table.
Yeah, and people will often ask for a lot of different things at the Synod. What congregations are doing this, and what congregation? we don't know unless we happen to run across it in a conversation. So if you guys find like someone who's doing reviews, you know, for congregations and you're really happy with, be sure to share them with us or other stuff too. And that way we can share it with other congregations when they ask, you know, so. All right, so I said I would do this and I will. Would anybody like to close us in prayer? And we could play the youth group game. So
I can do it. Thanks, Terry, and thanks everybody for being here. Gracious God, we thank you for this gathering and for all of these people who are wanting to be good stewards of your church. Thank you for Terri and her work in putting these resources together, and thank you for all of the people who are serving the congregations and ministries of Pacifica Synod. We ask your guidance and your blessing on our work, and we ask you to help us remember that the work of the church looks different, that there are different tasks that we all have to do, and to keep you at the center of all of our work and time and efforts. We ask your blessings on our weekend and for everyone's health and safety. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
thank you, Nicolette. Thank you all for giving up your Saturday. Now go outside, enjoy the sun.
Thanks, Terry.
All
Thanks,
right,
Terry.
have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Terry.